Hello, and welcome back. Today I will be reading How It Began, found on CreepyPasta, written by Hugo. The link to the story can be found in the description. The wind was blistering cold. The kind of wind that would pierce any clothing you would happen to be wearing, no matter how thick. Something about cold air makes sound travel further, especially high-pitched screaming. Even today, with our substantial medical advances, giving birth can be quite a trial. A couple of centuries ago, however, giving birth was nothing short of agony, if not torment. Surviving the ordeal was essentially flipping a coin. The women of the village were, of course, quite experienced with this particular problem. With a village this small, almost every woman there was a midwife. They knew the pain. They knew the screams. This was different. The usual screams were screams of pain, screams of longing for the peril to be over, screams of effort and stress. This was different. These screams were desperate. Urgent. These screams weren't ones of longing, but of craving for death. Screams that meant death is far from more preferable than one more moment of this. The village women were pale, stealing glances at each other, hoping for some assurance that this is normal. None found it. The soon-to-be mother was writhing on the ground, kicking away any soil under her feet. The sweat dripped off of her, mixing with her tears. Her teeth were all but eroded from the grinding. She was surrounded by women standing a few feet away, out of equally respect and fear. Finally, it was born. The village woman standing nearest ended up with it in her arms. A short scream escaped her lips, but got stuck in her throat as she froze. Another woman knelt down beside the new mother. She brushed the hair off the new mother's face. The new mother was no longer screaming. She was no longer writhing. She was no longer breathing. The stark silence that replaced the desperate screaming set in immediately. Everyone was scared to breathe. The woman kneeling next to the new mother realized the silence and looked up to find all the other women in the room were staring, horror-struck, at the newborn. The woman holding her was locked into her gaze, trapped in it. In the sudden quiet, any sound was audible. So when the woman whispered, "Julia," the sound traveled far. To the unknowing, it might seem as if the woman just gave the newborn girl a name. The villagers in the room knew, however, that Julia was the name of the woman holding the child. She just whispered her name as to answering a question. The other women all stared at her, unsure of what to do. Julia was staring at it, barely breathing, not moving. The women all simultaneously became aware that Julia's arms were becoming blue. The child was cold. Ice cold. That wasn't the only thing that made the women terrified to approach. They've seen many children being born. And all of them cried. All of them were confused. All of them had their eyes barely open and were flailing their legs and arms that they haven't learned how to use yet. This child, this thing, was quiet, calm. Her eyes were locked into Julia's. Her tiny chest was rising and falling slowly. Her body was still, her legs straight and her arms by her side. While Julia was gazing deep into her eyes, The other women were actively avoiding them. You don't have to take a glance for longer than a second to see what they were. Pitch black. Two black, glassy eyes were now staring at Julia. It won't be hard to get lost in them. They seemed to be an endless pit, an abyss in which Julia's mind now wandered. Julia! Julia, snap out of it! Julia! A shove to the shoulder and Julia's head snapped upward. She stared into her sister's eyes and didn't recognize her for a second. Realization slowly flowed into her face, and she looked at the room and the women around her, as if she had forgotten where she was. Julia! Her sister, Mary, said again, and Julia looked at her, now fully awake. You take it. You take it into the forest and you leave it there. You come back without it. You hear? Julia nodded. Julia, do you understand? Yes. Julia whispered. Julia, do not look into her eyes. Whatever you do, do not look into her eyes again. Do you understand? Yes, Julia whispered and nodded. The other women regarded her, holding their breath at her every answer. They were all thinking the same thing. They don't think Julia could be trusted to do it, but each of them would rather be found dead than do it themselves. They put their faith in Julia and prayed to God they won't regret it. Mary took her by the arm and led her outside of the tiny hovel now belonging to a dead woman. She nudged Julia toward the forest. Go, she said, and Julia listened. She walked, carrying a block of ice in her arms, and didn't look back. Most importantly, she didn't look down. She knew it was still staring at her. The newborn from the underworld. She could feel its eyes boring into her. The thing that about completely black eyes is that you can't be sure where they're looking. So it feels like they're always watching. Julia entered the forest. The baby seemed to grow heavier. The urge to look into its eyes seemed to grow stronger. It still did not cry, and the quiet around Julia was eerie, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Thin puffs of vapor erupted from Julia's lips when she breathed. That would explain the quiet. No animal would come out in this cold. The wind brushed past her, but in comparison to the newborn in her arms, anything felt warm. The tall trees around her creaked as they swayed in the wind. To Julia, it felt like even the trees were trying to get away from her. She was now deep in the forest. She didn't want to leave it near the village where the folk might hear it cry, although hearing it cry would almost be a relief. The calm, the silence was gnawing away at Julia's sanity. In front of her saw a stump and thought it would be an apt resting place for a new demon spawn. She walked forward and laid the newborn on it. The moment her skin wasn't touching it, warmth flooded, as if the blood dared to circulate again. She felt immense relief. It was heavy. It didn't weigh on her arms. It weighed on her entire body. She almost quivered and realized how tired she was, as if all the energy was drained from her. She took a deep breath and relaxed. This was when she let her guard down. Her eyes reopened and, unfortunately, was facing in the direction of the newborn. Her eyes flicked toward the two black holes in her vision, and there they stayed. Julia's body went stiff, and she continued staring. "Yes," she whispered suddenly, her thin, wavering voice echoing through the silence. I don't know, she whispered again. A few seconds of silence. I will, she replied and stepped forward. The child parted its lips to reveal 2 short fangs. Julia reached forward, placed her index finger on one of the fangs, and applied pressure. A tiny trickle of blood erupted from Julia's finger. Julia did not wince. She did not even register the pain. Julia retracted her arm, and her body relaxed as if released. Her eyes finally blinked and darted around because they were allowed. She spun on her heel and ran. The women of the village awaited her return with worried faces. A sigh of relief swept over them as Julia emerged from the forest trees. A greater sigh of relief came when they could clearly see there was no child with her. When Julia came near, her sister spoke. "Is it done?" she asked. Julia nodded, but said nothing. She was not in the mood for talking. In fact, all of them wanted to put this day behind them and erase it from their minds. The sun was kissing the horizon, and in their minds, all of them decided to crawl into bed early. In the dead of night, Julia awoke with a start. She shot upright. Her body was drenched in sweat. She felt as if something was slipping away. She kept dreaming that she was holding on to herself, a mirror image of her that was drifting away. She tried her best to grip, to hold on as tightly as possible, but her image was being pulled away by a force much greater than her. How frightening, she thought. Losing yourself, losing what you are. Something is happening to me and I don't know what. In her mind, she knew she would be frightened, terrified even, but in her heart, she wasn't. She was feeling numb. Her quick breathing shortly went away, as if a vestige of a former self. She laid down again, calm as ever, and started dreaming of much less frightening things. It was a Thursday. The men would be gathering in the old cottage for a game of panquist and mead. Mary's husband kissed her on the cheek and set off to the village. She thought she might visit Julie and leave the laundry for tomorrow. Julia, who is yet to marry, is still living in her parents' home. She stayed there after they perished to the bloody flux. She didn't want to talk about the previous day. She didn't want to think about it. They told the men nothing, and they wistfully went about their lives. The women had a burden to bear, and Mary did not want to bear it alone. Perhaps she and Julia could have some meads together, and to calm the nerves. She placed the unwashed laundry back in her home and headed toward Julia's home. She expected Julia outside, tending the vegetables or doing some laundry of her own. There is always laundry to be done, especially when you have to wear 5 layers. However, when she drew near, she noticed the door was closed and the window shut with the curtains down. The whole world grew a blue tinge as the sun finally dipped behind the trees. She walked to the door and banged on it with her fist. "Julia, are you home?" she called, but no reply. She kept banging until she heard the door being unlocked. The door slowly creaked open, and she made her way inside. "It's so dark in here," she said as her eyes struggled to focus on the silhouette of Julia. "I like it dark," Julia replied in a slow whisper. "Julia, are you ill? What is the matter?" she asked cautiously.
Thirsty,
came Julia's reply. What an odd way Julia was acting. Her eyes finally adjusted, and she stared at Julia, who was staring back at her with dull eyes. Was your hair always black? She whispered and stepped toward Julia, whose hair was obstructing her face. She didn't leave her home today. She was still in her nightgown. Mary reached to brush the hair out of her eyes when Julia's head snapped forward. She bared her teeth and tried biting her sister's fingers. Mary withdrew her hand with a short yelp and took several steps backward. Julia! What in the devil's name?
Come,
Julia said. Her eyes were no longer dull, but glowed like fire. She bared her teeth, and that's when her sister saw it. Fangs. Julia hid fangs beneath her lips. She turned and ran. She shot through the door and into the sudden dark night, toward the old cottage where she knew her husband was. She felt Julia gaining on her. She expected at any moment to feel Julia's hands wrap around her throat, to feel her fangs dig into her. She risked a look backward and saw nothing. Julia wasn't right behind her. Julia was nowhere she could see. She kept on running and threw open the door of the old cottage. The four men sitting around the table started at the sound. She's coming! She's coming, and she's going to kill me! Mary, what's going on? Who's coming? Replied her husband. It's Julia! She's gone mad! She's not Julia anymore. She wants to kill me. She'll kill all of us, she screamed. She didn't know how she knew, but she saw more than a person in Julia's eyes. She saw a world filled with fire, a world drenched in blood. Through Julia's eyes, she saw a terrible future and a will stronger than any to make it come to pass. In that moment, she understood that her sister was lost. Only the fire remained. The men didn't know why, but they believed her. Her fear radiated through the room, and they felt it. Ominousness filled the air. Everyone's hair stood on end. She closed the door behind her and ran to the arms of her husband. The men had stood up from their game and stared at the door expectantly. It has been long speculated that every living being has a sense of doom. Some part of them knows that they are going to die. It's an easy enough feeling to shake off. Telling yourself you're just being silly or superstitious usually does the trick. Couple this feeling with overwhelming fear, however, and it is undeniable. They could feel their last seconds ticking away. They could feel the last of their grains starting to fall. All of them knew they were about to die.